I'll welcome Armin in a minute. First of all, rules of the game. Please turn off your videos and also your microphones. The videos for reasons of distraction, we have a recording, and microphones for obvious reasons of interference. You can switch your microphone back on when you're called to pose a question. Please indicate with raised hand on the system. I'll try and do it fairly, first come, first serve for the questions. So that's basically the protocol. So, Marion, your camera's still on. Right. Okay. I'd like to formally welcome Armin Schulz from the University of Kansas. Welcome, Armin. We're very much looking forward to your talk on very important issues on the evolution of propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. Again, I think that's originally a quote from Adam Smith. Very relevant for our discussions. Welcome, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'm very glad to be here. Yeah, it's very exciting, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So the first thing really I want to say is this. So this talk is drawing on work from my book that came out last year. The book's called "It's Only Human: The Evolution of Distinctively Human Cognition." So I'm not just telling you this because it's like advertising. That's not why I'm telling you this. What I think the thing is, what makes writing a book for me so exciting, one of the things that makes it so exciting, is that you can really draw out in more depth the different parts of a theory. You can lay out a picture and have different parts explained in detail, and you don't have to explain them again, but then you can sort of develop a whole that is in some sense more than the sum of its parts, where you can really show how the different parts of the theory interact with each other, because you've got more space to go into this. The sad part about this here is then that because I'm not in a position to give you the whole book, that would be crazy. I'm just gonna lay out sort of the theory. There's going to be lots of different bits that we can talk about in more depth as we go on. So I'm giving you a slice of what this looks like. But again, I'm really happy to talk more in depth about various aspects of this. Okay, with that preamble out of the way, here we go. So the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, as Jeff mentioned, that's of course a quote from Adam Smith in the early parts of The Wealth of Nations. And for Smith, the idea is that this is something that makes humans standouts. We're different in these ways from what is found elsewhere in the biological world. And Smith thinks that's very important. So Smith contrasts humans here with dogs. The two dogs want a bone. They fight over the bone. They don't engage in a mutually beneficial trade arrangement. If humans, at least sometimes, want the same sort of things, they do exactly this. They engage in truck, barter, and exchange and find gains of trade, and everyone sort of benefits in these outcomes. Humans do that, non-humans don't do that, and that seems to be a really important part of human living. Arguably, in fact, I'll come back to this. Arguably, this idea of the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange is the fulcrum on which much of social science rests. Much of the work in anthropology and social theory is really trying to focus in on this question: how is it that humans manage to truck, barter, and exchange, to cooperate by means of truck, barter, and exchange? Understanding that arguably is understanding much of human social living. Now, the first thing to do when it comes to thinking about the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange is really to think about exactly what that propensity is. What does that mean? And there's several different ways to think about this, but one of the sort of key issues here, I think, is that you can have a broader or a narrow view about trade or exchange. On some sense, you could think about exchange as just reciprocal cooperation. An organism does something and another organism reciprocates, for example. Obviously, reciprocal cooperation, in this regard, really humans are not standouts. Particularly, lots of organisms on the planet engage in reciprocal exchanges of one kind or another. They're not. It's not. There's some literature on exactly how widespread exactly sort of reciprocal altruism is, but various forms of reciprocation happen in various parts of the biological world, from plants to single-celled organisms to cleaner fish and vampire bats, and there's sort of lots of cases where organisms exchange. That's not quite, I don't think, what Smith is after, and that's not quite what I'm after here. There's a different way to understand trade, and this is how I want to understand trade, which is when it concerns the exchange of property claims. So we reciprocally cooperate not by returning a favor effectively, but by doing something where I have a property claim on something else, you have a property claim on something else, and we exchange these property claims. That, I think, is sort of, arguably, that's a uniquely human thing, and that gets at something really special about how humans interact with each other. So what I want to look into and try to explain is why it is that humans have evolved the capacity to engage in this kind of exchange relations, this kind of cooperation through extensive property relations that are being exchanged in reciprocal cooperative interactions. I think that's interesting and important for lots of reasons, because it's fascinating. It's a core problem to social sciences, as I mentioned. If you're into economics, that's important. I think it's an inroad into lots of aspects of distinctive human cognition, hence the rest of the sort of how it fits into the rest of the book as well. But that's not really what I'm going to talk about, but I'm happy to talk about this later. Now, the first thing to note is that it turns out Smith was slightly wrong here in thinking that humans are really the only organisms that have a sense of property exchange, and we're the only ones that engage in this kind of trading relation. Now, I should say, if you're a Smith fan, this is actually a very short discussion, and actually discussion is really quite, there's a lot of really fun hints, and I'll mention some of them as we go on. This is not a historical talk or theory, so I'm not really engaging in Smith exegesis. And so Smith doesn't care that much about like arguing for this in detail. The point is really just, you might have thought, well, it's not crazy to think, and for a long time people did think this, that we're the only organisms that engage in this kind of exchange. That turns out to be wrong. So for a couple of decades now, there's been a lot of cool work on various non-human animals and looking at what kind of trading you find and kind of property exchange trading you find in non-human animals. So this is actually fairly old footage from like 15 years ago or so. This is Sarah Brosnan working in her lab. And she's working with these chimps, and she has in the little bucket on her left, there are various tokens, and she puts them on this little tray. And these chimps have learned that they can exchange tokens of different color effectively for different food items on the other side of the enclosure. In this case, and they've done various follow-up studies. This is just a still from one of these studies, an older study. And as I said, there's many decades of work now. It is absolutely the case that property relations are understood in some sense, by various groups of organisms. And that's sort of obvious if you think about territoriality being very widespread in the animal kingdom. Now, territoriality, as I'll say later, isn't quite the same as what we're looking at when it comes to human trading, but it is it's one step on the way to this sort of richer human trading propensity. And so territoriality is widespread, and so lots of animals have various ways of understanding this is mine, and various animals have ways of understanding I can exchange this thing for this other thing. So chimps have been shown to do that. So it's not the case that we're the only organisms that can exchange things and own things in some sense. So that's the first thing to note. It is also really important to note that the importance of trade and personal property of a propensity struck Barter exchange is in fact culturally highly variable. It's important to note that it's easy to sort of think, well, trade is everywhere and then we're all trading all day long. That's not quite right. So lots of human groups don't engage in much trade at all. So there's the Hadza, a picture of a group of Hadza folks, where private property is quite rare. So the idea is something like you have a knife because obviously you need a knife to get through the world. But if you happen to have a second knife, there's no real sense that this is now yours. The second knife is for everyone to use because you already have a knife. Why would you don't need two knives. So the second knife doesn't belong to you. That's just for everyone to use. If you have two on you, then I'll take the second one if I need it. There's basically communal sharing of all resources among the Hadza. I'll come back to some of the Hadza later. So the important point I want to emphasize here, that human trading, yes, it's something that is there seems to be something special, but let's not forget that human trading is actually culturally highly variable, and it's just not the case that we're all humans always rely heavily on this propensity struck Barter exchange. That's cool. Still, there is, I think it is exactly right. Smith is exactly right. There is something unique about human trading. We just have to figure out exactly what that is. And to get at this, the first thing, here's your stock picture of the stock market, as it were. The first thing to note, I want to note, is that trading matters to people. As I say, it is not the case that all humans rely on trade, but some humans rely on trade for everything. Lives depend on trading relations. That's not just because you're a stock trader, but in some sense, human cooperative relations have, in some sense, expanded to the point where many parts of the world will collapse if trading wouldn't be able to happen in the ways it does. So that's just something to note. Come back to that later too. The other thing to note is that when you think about the kind of stuff, and if you see on the left and the right, that's the red circles there, and you can't obviously see this in detail, the kind of stuff we trade is extremely widespread. That is to say, unlike in non-human animals where maybe property relations are restricted to things like the territory you own, maybe foodstuffs you own, we humans can recognize property claims on an extremely wide set of things. Some of them can be extremely abstract, intangible in lots of ways, including sort of non-fungible tokens, NFTs. We can own air rights, we can trade derivatives, we can trade or own futures. Think about what it means to own a future. There's nothing you can hold on to or see. We can trade effectively. I can own a bet, whatever that might mean, and I can exchange that property claim on a bet with you. This is a monstrous step up from owning territory, land, or owning food stuff. And so the thing, I think, what makes human property claims so unique is that they have a very rich depth. They can comprise a lot of things that we just don't see in non-human animals. Property relations in humans are also extremely widespread, or in exchange relations are widespread, and that's the sort of the point about the importance of it. We trade a lot of things. We don't just trade property relations. We trade all sorts of things on the market. We trade territory. We can buy land and sell that. We can and we buy, you can buy bananas and sell those, but you can also buy futures and air rights and things like that. So that's that. The second thing that's sort of unique, I think, about human trading is that we think about exchange in extremely complex ways. It's not just that I think what you have and what do I have and what you want, and we think about it. When we think about exchange, we have an extremely complex understanding of exchange. We think about the uncertainty involved in an exchange. We think about the kind of volatilities and correlations that it might be involved in exchanging one thing for another and how that relates to other things. So we're able to make trading decisions not just based on, say, what's available and what we want, but we can take into account a vast array of other things surrounding our trading relations. Okay, so really this narrows down, I think, our question. What we want to explain it is not some general sense of exchange. We want to explain how it is that humans are able to think of property as something that's extremely wide and deep, as something that, so that's to say, how are we able to, we humans are able to conceptualize owning things like air rights and derivatives and futures and NFTs, are able to think about exchanging those things in often extremely complex ways and lots of different things at lots of different times with lots of other people around the world. That's our problem. It's this sort of the explanation of this wide and deep sense of property, a wide and deep sense of exchange value, and a really strongly developed disposition of reciprocal cooperation funneled through these two rich concepts. So that's what we want. That's what we want to explain. Now, on the face of it, looking at what people have done when it comes to explaining distinctively human cognition in other areas, there's three main strategies that might come to mind and that people have explored. The first is some version of a nativist theory. So you might sort of think, look, here's the thing: you want to explain distinctively human cognition when it comes to trade. You say there's something uniquely human about how we think about property claims or exchange value claims or reciprocal cooperation. You got to start by thinking, well, that's the kind of neurocognitive mechanisms that humans have evolved. They're just kind of different from what we find in non-human animals. Humans lived in very specific socio-ecological environments. In those kind of environments, there was a lot of selective pressures to rely on concepts like this. So humans that had these concepts did better than non-humans, than humans that didn't have these concepts. And so we over time saw the selective pressure for these concepts. So we're effectively born with rich concepts of property and exchange value and a strong disposition for reciprocal cooperation. Of course, these might have to mature over time, but they're key parts of our biological machinery, and we have them, and that's the explanation. That's sort of it. You can spell out the story in a little bit more detail, and again, if more time we could go into more detail, but the basic idea really is something like this: that we humans lack major physical adaptations to the world. We're dependent on others to make our way through the world, and since we live in interesting social environments, we're not like, say, the social insects. There's lots of kin, but there are lots of non-kin around, and the kind of cooperative relations that we can form require really tracking what other people's social roles are, what their expectations are, and it requires a good understanding of the fundamentals of biology, physics, mathematics, but arguably also economics, because of the importance of trade. If you have a leg up in understanding property and exchange, you are better at cooperating with others. You can realize gains from trade in ways that other people can't, and that gives you a better chance to make a successful living in this kind of cooperation dependent socio-ecological setting. And that's what happened, and so we've evolved it. So sometimes people talk about the fact that we have we should think that humans evolved a folk biology and a folk physics, and there's sort of a natural human number sense, and on this theory, we should just add, we also have a folk economics. We have a basic sense of property and exchange and so on. That's just evolved as part of our biological makeup. And we'll come back to the learning in a second. what can we say about this sort of picture? I think there's lots of things that are quite positive about this account. As I mentioned, this kind of story has been told about other parts of the mind, folk biology, folk physics, mind reading, for example. And there's some good theoretical reasons for thinking that gets at something. For example, there's sort of classic old arguments from cognitive science that suggest that if you have to make some of these kind of inferences and navigations to the world, if you had to learn it from scratch, it would just take too long. If you had to figure out, if you have to like sort of derive something like economics 101 from scratch when you're a teenager making your way through the world, that's probably impossible. Any organism that had a leg up would out trade you very, very quickly, if it's possible at all to learn this by just sort of looking around you. It's also empirically plausible in lots of ways. Yes, human trading is culturally specific. We do see human trade in lots of cultures around the world, and I'll come back to this in a second. There's some interesting relations to note there as well. One of them is that the Hadza, for example, while they don't rely on a lot of trade, and so interestingly, they have been found not to display an endowment effect, which is sort of a crude measure of something to do with trade. The Hadza do display an endowment effect and have no problem exchanging things and engaging in trade to the extent that they end up working as tour guides for like safari tours or whatever. So it's very easy for the Hadza to figure out how to become traders, even if you grew up in a non-trading environment, which suggests that there might be just something there that you just tap into. And the other positive aspect of this account is that if we're born with an innate endowment about property and exchange thinking, well, that predicts straightforwardly that only humans would display that, because we have this, or very few organisms, at least only organisms that would develop or evolve in similar environments as humans do would have that. And if these are very uniquely human environments, then only humans would be expected to have that, and that's exactly what we find. So that's helpful for this regard. But there's some negative aspects of that theory as well, and one of them that's sort of, I think, chronically underestimated is that it's actually completely, it's one thing to have a rich understanding of property relations and to have a rich understanding of exchange, and it's a completely different thing to actually use that in practice. To me, that's like the equivalent of saying, well, you've got some basic understanding of economics, right? Like, because we're born with it, so you don't need to take classes in this stuff, and all trading will be easy. That turns out to be wrong. It sometimes figuring out what how to exchange is extremely complex. It's extremely time consuming, and can be bewildering. Just going to buy a car, and then all the tricks the car salesmen throw on you, and that's just a minor problem compared to all the trading decisions we have to make. And if you have to do this in real time, with lots of different things hitting you, that's very difficult. So we need some account that translates the ability to think about rich concepts of property and exchange value and translate that into action. And this theory doesn't have it. This theory just says we have these concepts, we're done. But I think we can't just be done. We have to go beyond that. We have to provide a further theory of how we actually use these concepts that we have. The other thing, as I noted, is that it's just there. Yeah, it's true. We see trading in lots of cultures, and lots of cultures do some. We find it around the world, and lots of people can engage in trade even if they don't trade very much. Ordinarily, it's still the case that trading is extremely culturally variable. So we need some account of why that is. If we're all born with the same biological endowment for trade, then why is there all this variability? You need some story for that. Sorry, this chair is weird. Which brings us to the second account. This is a cultural learning based account. That's also extremely popular type of account. It just says if you want to understand distinctive human cognition for anything, including trade, you've got to think about the fact that we're social learners. So anyone from Cecilia Hayes, Mike Tomasello, Boyd and Richardson, Joe Henrich, this is the sort of rough story that you get out of that literature. Georgia and Sheba. So it could be that there's lots of reasons for why that is. It could be that we're just natural pedagogues. That's the Georgia and Sheba story, or we have this ability for shared intention. That's the Tomasello thing, and sort of roughly out of shared intentions come re-intentions, and that gives us sort of cultural learning in different ways. Or we're just like really, we have all these lower level capacities, like we're socially tolerant and we're really good at paying attention to what other people are doing. That's a sort of Cecilia Hayes thing. And out of these bunch of these lower level capacities, we can then develop a capacity for cultural learning. All of that's true, whatever. The important part of this story is that here's what's distinctive about humans. We figure out what other people are doing, and we're really good at taking on good ideas from other people and running with them. So it's all about understanding human cognition is all about understanding the fact that the sort of the unique dynamics that arise from the fact that that we pick up what other people are doing. And that matters because we can fine-tune our behavior to aspects of our environment that change too quickly for traditional biological genetic evolution can access to. It changes over generations, but not sufficiently. It changes sufficiently quickly to so that genes don't have a time to get really fixed in that kind of population. But through cultural learning, we can still do this. And trading is arguably a part of this. Sort of the idea is that, well, we're not really born with rich concepts of exchange or trade value, but what we have is that we're born with a good capacity to learn stuff. And I can learn to trade. Like I might not be a born trader, but I can be a learned trader. And so I look around what other people are doing, and I figure out these guys do a lot of trading stuff. I think that's a good idea. I should do that too. And that gets me slowly by thinking, these people say you can own air rights. Well, that's weird. Like, that seems right. What could I do with air rights? And then I run from there. So what's positive about this? Well, again, there's a lot of theory and there's lots of data that support this. We know that cultural learning matters. There's lots of great studies on the extent to which various things are culturally learned. And that's, in some ways, that's, I think what's fascinating to me is sort of on the empirical side, that's become sort of bread and butter. Like, because of the social media stuff, the idea of all of these like social media fads and weird memes and what goes viral makes it very intuitive for people that these kind of patterns can arise. And I'm not going to talk about 6 and 7 and things like this. That if you know, you know. If you don't know, you're better off not knowing. So this has become quite common. But there's lots of theory also really support the idea that this makes sense of a lot of aspects of human cognition that would be hard to make sense of otherwise, like why if most people would drop near the Arctic Circle now, we would all perish because we couldn't make a living through this. But humans have figured out to live there for a long time. So how is that possible? Well, the obvious explanation is that the reason it's possible is that if you go slowly and over generations, you can culturally transmit information about how to make your living to lots of different environments. But you need this cultural knowledge. You need historical data to make your way through the world. Okay. What's also positive about cultural learning based accounts is that it just straightforwardly gets you cultural variation. Yeah, we would expect if we're culturally learning to be traders, then of course we're going to have different amounts of trade in different cultures, because that's exactly what we find in lots of other culturally determined things. That's great. That's easy. Here's what's negative about it. Two things. First, there's some story needs to be told about why we're good cultural learners. Often these accounts sort of start with this idea that we're cultural learners, but we need some theory of how we're cultural learners. Now, as I said, there are lots of different theories of why that is, but there's some controversy on this. So I think you can't just say we're cultural learners. You have to then sort of explain why it is that we're cultural learners. And there are answers there, but just to waive, like, we need some account of that. But secondly, and more importantly for here, in a different way, this just gives us a different answer to the question of where we got rich and wide and deep concepts of property and exchange value and the strong dispositions for reciprocal cooperation, where that comes from. It still needs an answer to the question of how we actually use that. Like, how can we go ahead and make sense of that? You know, it's one thing to say, you know, we've culturally learned to think about property relations. We still have the problem of, like, now how do we use this in practice? If I find myself having to make trading decisions in real life, it's just a different way to get here, but it still has that problem. And the other thing is that, of course, because it's very good about the variation part, it's not so good about the universality part. So if there's all this, if cultural learning is the driver of trading relations, then why is it that, yeah, sure, the Huds that don't engage in much trade, why do they find it so easy to switch to trade when they're surrounded by a bunch of Europeans and a safari group? Why is that? Put differently, you know, it's normally with cultural learning, the idea is it needs to sort of sit in over generations. We need to learn from others over generations to really get the benefits of this. But this doesn't look like this. It seems like we can switch on and off this trading thing. So there's something more to say about that. Which brings us to the third account here, and these, I'm going to call them simple processing accounts, systematicity-based accounts. In lots of ways, maybe lots of you, that might be your first account that you jump to here, and that's what I mentioned. Adam Smith, I think, waves at this and says something like, "Oh, mate, why are we such?" Sorry, there's just some noise going on. Maybe it's something to do with logic, or maybe something to do with language. That's why we're so good at traders and why non-human animals aren't. Maybe that's something to do with it. The way I want to think about this is, you can sort of say what's going on is that, well, to understand, you might think, well, humans have these rich and wide concepts of property and exchange value and strong disposition for reciprocal cooperation. Where's that coming from? Well, you might sort of say, well, you've got to understand that it's just part of this, the fact that humans are extremely rich representationally across the board. We have a rich language of thought where we can formulate extremely complex and abstract concepts around on lots of different topics, and including trade. Right, like what's the benefit of a language of thought? You can recursively formulate thoughts, and an unlimited number of thoughts, because we have a structure to our thinking. And then I can fine tune my behavior to all sorts of circumstances, because I can sort of formulate responses just sort of through logic and the structure of my thought processes that's tailored to that specific situation. There's been lots of work, sort of famously, on the language of thought in different capacities. And so arguably, to make sense of speaking in a natural language, which is really important for humans, and cooperatively, maybe that requires some kind of systematicity of thought to underlie this in different ways, and maybe understanding social causal cognition, tool use, social cognition, moral cognition, cultural learning itself. Maybe all of these things need to be understood as happening on this backdrop of a rich, systematically structured language of thought. And you might think, well, trading is just another aspect of this. So we effectively would construct rich concepts of property and exchange value and a disposition for cooperation. We construct that out of the representations we have, and we just use our language of thought to do that. What's positive about this, again, there's lots of cool work on the systematicity of thought and why it matters, and I briefly mentioned some of this, so I won't go into more detail. I'm happy to, and for time reasons, talk too long already. So I'm gonna we can talk about that later. I just want to mention there's a couple of things that's sort of tricky. The first is yes, language of human thought is arguably systematic, but how systematic is it? It's just not the case that we generate abstract concepts about every topic. Sometimes we have these blinds that we can't figure something out, and that's how lots of crime stories work. That, you know, if you read Agatha Christie, you're like, sometimes, at least if you don't read too many of them, you'll be surprised who the murderer is. But arguably, if the crime story is well written, you should have been able to deduce this all along. But if we're so good at making inferences like this and combining concepts in different ways, how can that be a surprise to us, given that we've been given all the hints in the right sort of ways? And arguably, non-human animals also rely on some version of a systematicity of thought, at least in maybe in a simpler way. So it seems like this doesn't give us quite the disconnect maybe that Smith thought it would give us. It still doesn't explain how we're able to use these rich and abstract complex representations in real life. It doesn't explain non-representational parts of our cognition. So it's quite good about making sense of rich concepts of property and exchange value. It's less good on the strong dispositions for reciprocal cooperation. It's one thing to be able to say, well, yeah, I understand rich property relations, I understand rich exchange value. It's a whole different thing to say, and I'm willing to engage in trading with complete strangers on the other side of the world. How is that being explained here? It's not obvious how appealing to the systematicity of thought is going to get us that. What the other thing that famously this account doesn't give us a story of is, where do these representations come from? So Fowler, in an early account, ended up having basically a vast stock of innate basic concepts to draw from, which is widely thought not to be terribly plausible. But otherwise, you need some way to sort of supplement this with something else, maybe cultural learning or maybe some innate account. In lots of ways, that's what I suggest we'll do going forward. What I want to suggest to make progress is to take the best of all these three accounts and put it in a pot and stir it. And this is kind of where would be nice if the rest of the book tries to spell this out in more detail. But just to give you a flavor of what that might look like, I think the nativists are right to say, for both theoretical and empirical reasons, it is plausible to say that humans start out with an endowment of concepts of property and exchange value and the extensive disposition for reciprocal cooperation. That's just different. That is because we do, the nativist accounts are right that the kind of environments humans inhabited provided selective advantage to organisms with these stronger concepts. And being good traders gave you a leg up in those environments. So there was selective pressures to be a good trader, to have that innate endowment. I think that the nativists get that right. And one way I like to think about this is that if you had to figure out how to make your way through this kind of environment, there's just too many possibilities, an indefinite set of inferences you could draw about how to make your way through the world. And through evolutionary pressures, you get a much narrower set of inference that you're even considering. And so you're starting with expectations of where to look for the kind of things that might get you successfully navigating this world. So you start by thinking maybe ownership stuff is a good way to think about it. Maybe exchange is a good way to think about how to make your way through the world. So it just narrows the kind of stuff I have to do, and that gives me a leg up. I'm going to be quite quick about this. This is just so I don't think, unlike some of the traditional nativist accounts, they think all of these different parts of our minds are sort of different modules that are disconnected from each other. I don't think that's right. I think they just have different histories, but we all sort of rely on the same thing. That won't matter too much for us here, but I can talk about it at length later. What I want to suggest is that that's the nativists get that right, but I want to suggest agree with the other two accounts, that doesn't fully explain human trade. I want to note that it's not the case that necessarily we get major differences here between human and non-human cognition. So we start out with slightly richer understandings of property and exchange value, maybe a slightly stronger disposition for reciprocal cooperation with strangers. That's great. That makes us slightly different, but it doesn't quite explain the difference between chimp trading and the New York Stock Exchange. It also doesn't explain how we're able to use these concepts all the time in daily life, in real time. And it doesn't explain why human trade is, as I say, is so extensive. Like, it just doesn't give you the New York Stock Exchange. To get at that, I want to take a quick step back. So here's a basic trading game, and if you look at this with one glance, you'll recognize this is just the prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma is just a very general model of it's a very general social dilemma. It can apply to lots of circumstances, and arguably, I think something like this might apply to lots of trading relations. So if we face the choice, we both have things that we want from each other. Here's the best outcome for me is if I take yours and not give you mine. So that's the sort of bullying theft solution that gives me 4 and gives you nothing. You lose what you have and I gain everything. That's great. If you fight back and we end up just not trading, then we end up with what we have, which is it's not bad, but it's not amazing either. That's the no trade equilibrium. But if we could just engage in trade, there's the mutual beneficial gains of trade to be had here. So trade is the Pareto efficient outcome if we could get to it. Now, famously, in a prisoner's dilemma, if you play this in many versions of a prisoner's dilemma, the only equilibrium is no trade. But also famously, there are lots of other equilibria in these games. It just depends on exactly what the nature of the game is. So one way to make other equilibria possible in these kind of situations is if you increase the number of iterations of the game. Shift this game from a finitely repeated game to an indefinitely repeated game. Make this the kind of thing that you can play, that you just don't know if this is the final round of the game. So any kind of backwards induction won't kick in. So if this game all of a sudden is just part of a long series of games, then all sorts of equilibria become possible, including trade. I mean, that's the folk theorem of game theory. Says once you go beyond the finitely repeated games, anything is possible. Roughly, all sorts of things are equilibrium, but including trade. But how do we move from a one-shot version of this or a finitely repeated version of this game to an infinitely repeated version of this game? Well, what we need is to make one trading relation really just part of a long possible chain of trading relations. So if I can exchange one thing with one other person, if all we're doing is exchanging land, then there's a clear limit to the amount of interactions I might have with you. If you're a foreign trader that you come into this market and I'm never gonna trade with you again, there's a clear limit to that makes these interactions finite. But if we could just build some version of saying, well, this trading relation is just part of a longer set of trading relations. So maybe we could build a reputation where I might not interact with you again, but maybe you could track my reputation on the marketplace, some sort of rating system like on Uber. Then I might only have one interaction with you, but you have lots of interactions, or I have lots of interactions with others like you. And that makes this all of a sudden part of a longer game. That's what I just said. So the more things I can trade with more others through one reason or another makes this a potentially indefinitely repeated game. That opens up many more equilibria. Secondly, you can make other equilibria possible if we could sort of arrange people into groups in different ways. If we could just exclude the ones that are somehow inclined to be cheaters and not traders. If we're sort of, you can get, even with one-shot interactions, you can get trade to mean equilibrium. as long as you're more disposed to hang around other people that are disposed to be traders. You just want to sort of avoid hanging around with the cheaters. So if we could figure out who the cheaters are and not hang around with them, then if you're disposed to be a trader, that would work well too. These are all well-known stuff. So how do we do that? Well, our innate concepts of trade give us sort of a leg up to thinking about this, but this is where we need some kind of technology to help us figure out how to move this, how to make lots of things tradable with lots of others, track their reputation, exclude those that have cheated us in different ways, which helps us figure out where other things can be traded. Technology of this kind could be physical technology, like ways of tracking who owns what. That's the Senkeret tablet. That's actually an interesting piece of technology. It's like squares. It's probably an early teaching tool, a point I will come back to in a second, and I promise I'm almost done. These are quipus. These are knots that lots of different cultures use to probably track who, maybe ownership relations, maybe other information about the past. That's the tableau économique. That's the physiocrat Keynes way of understanding the French economy at the time. Not so important for us. Here, what matters about is effectively an accounting balance. If we could just have accounting conventions, we keep track of what goes in, what goes out. That's a much better way to figure out if a trade is fair. For example, are you trying to cheat me? Well, let's think about this. But also, well-run institutions could be a kind of technology like this. If we just had a market system, like in a way, that's what Uber, for example, does. It provides a marketplace with a rating system where the different sides can come together. And while each interaction is part of a one-shot, because there's an institution that enables us to track reputations and give sort of conflict resolution mechanisms, that changes the game. I can rely on that institution to do this. I know there'll be people on that exchange on the other side. Anyway, we'll talk about it in more detail later. So it's because we have technology like this, whether it's institutions or whether it's physical technology, that we can rely and use our rich concepts of property and exchange value. They provide storage for this kind of information. They provide computational aids, and that makes it possible to move from finitely repeated versions of the trading game to indefinitely repeated versions of the trading game to exclude cheaters and therefore make trade equilibria feasible. So it moves us from being able to think about effectively being in a trade equilibrium to actually being in a trade equilibrium. So from having a narrowed set of inferences, what we're looking for, maybe trading is a good solution here. Cognitive and tools brings into the foreground that yes, trading is the option here. I'm not saying obviously theft would go out of the window. There might still be theft, but maybe there's going to be less theft. Lots of people. And so just to close the loop here, and as I say, I'm almost done. Where do we get that technology from? How do we get these kind of tools and these kind of institutions from? Well, cultural learning, I think, is the widely accepted answer for that. So obviously the New York Stock Exchange, and I don't know if this picture is from the New York Stock Exchange. Oh yeah, it is. It says that in the background. It didn't come out of nowhere. Obviously, there's lots of information that went into the New York Stock Exchange. Lots of people from the Lloyd's of London to, what's her name, Margaret, whatnot, in the 80s that sort of developed how to think about trading institutions different ways. So the kind of trading institutions that we rely on grow over time and get more sophisticated. But of course, the same goes for the physical technology. So this is, so if we think of just to pick some random folks, Laplace as a pioneer of computational technology, to Ada Lovelace as another pioneer of computation technology. The kind of computers that these guys on the New York Stock Exchange rely on that make it possible for us to track who owns what and things like that. It's a modern technology of modern version in lots of cultures of quipus. Well, they don't come out of nowhere. That takes time to build. But we don't have to do this from scratch every generation. We can rely on insights from others over time to do that. And so now we can close an interactionist feedback loop. And that's really what I want to suggest. This is the heart of the theory. Here's what these other theories have gone wrong. They try to emphasize one aspect of this, but that's not going to get you distinctively human anything. And it certainly doesn't give you distinctively human trading. To understand distinctly human trading, you got to understand the fact that we have a slightly stronger endowment of abstract, rich concepts of property and exchange, a stronger disposition for reciprocal cooperation. But without technological enhancement, that wouldn't get us rich trading relations. To get that kind of rich, enhanced technology, we need to rely on cultural learning. Now, the cultural learning that we have can then enhance further the kind of concepts we rely on. I can teach you economics and how to be a better trader, which allows you to build more sophisticated technologies through a division of labor. And once you sort of have a market of trade going, we can specialize in teaching. We can specialize in building computing technology. We can become specialized traders, which keeps on ratcheting the process up. So to conclude, why are humans such extensive traders? That's because of this feedback loop. It's not about having an innate endowment. That's true. We need that too. But it's putting that innate endowment to work in the right sort of socio-technological environments. But why don't we see humans trade all the time in the same ways around both space and time? Well, it's because, yeah, we all have that capacity, but we need the right kind of institutions to kickstart it. And where for one reason or another, the technologies or institutions are different or not in place, there's nothing to bite for our trading relations. That if you know they don't, if you live in a social environment where institutions are different, then the trading equilibria don't become available to you. Like with the Hadza, it might be that they don't play quite the prisoner's dilemma game. If for them the no trade solution is the high value solution, then that's just a different structure of the game. There's some data supporting this. We can talk about this. And really, that's just to summarize the account. So how we explain the similarities and differences in trading across people. Well, it's really, we stand out with the kind of concepts we have, but they need to be enriched in the kind of cultural and social technological environment. And how do we use our complex representations, as I complained about with other accounts? Well, we use technology to do that. And why are we able to build this technology? Because of cultural learning that is enriched through the kind of innate representational endowment we have, which is itself enhanced by technology, which is itself the product of technology. So human propensity to struck barter and exchange results are, I think, plausibly not from one of the things. It's not just about like an innate endowment. It's not just about culture, and it's not just about technology. It's about all of it in a complex dynamic relationship. Lots of people have, and the idea of this kind of story is, I should also mention this sort of methodologically, the kind of philosophy I do is to say, I'm interested in sort of thinking like, here's what these people have done over here, and here's what these people have done over here, and here's what these people have done over there. And there's really cool interrelation that's put it all together. So instead of saying all these people are wrong, I want to say they're all partly right. Let's get all the partly right things from these folks together. I think that's cool about trade, but arguably it tells us a lot about lots of things. It's really understanding only human cognition. It's really about understanding this feedback loop between cultural learning, social technology, cognitive technology, and our innate representational endowment. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Armin. It's really very interesting how you developed that argument with the key steps and a comparison with the different other approaches. I found that very illuminating. Anyone like to raise a question? Okay, I'll start then. Okay, I mean, you've given us a huge sweep, Armin.
Yeah.
Starting with chimpanzees or things around there, going through into humans, good example of African tribe, And then much more modern things were writing, technology, even up to computers, modern stock markets and so on. Well,
Yep.
that's great. I have nothing in principle against that. I just have some qualms along the way.
Yeah,
I
please.
mean, for example, taking the chimpanzee case, is the chimpanzee really learning or having a concepts of property or exchange? It seems to me the chimp, clever as they are, got great respect for them, is learning that if it hands over a yellow token, it gets an orange, and if it hands over a green token, it gets something else. It's learning that, and that's pretty cool, but it doesn't really convince me that a deeper concept of possession or property is there with the chimp, or a notion of exchange. It simply learns, if I do this, I get something nice in return. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So two things. You're exactly right. So the browse and stuff on trade, that was meant to in the first sense illustrate the idea of exchange relations. So to what extent can chimps think about exchanging this one thing for another? The point you're raising on that is spot on. That's been a concern for this kind of study, is what exactly is it that the chimps are learning in these studies?
Yeah.
And they've since done this with macaques and other primates, actually. It is so. I'm a huge fan of Sarah Brosnan's work. And what's fascinating about it is because it's just so hard to come up with cool experiments that get at that. Like, how can you be sure they're not learning this really other specific thing? Maybe they don't understand trade. They just sort of learn to associate an orange token with an orange, and then they go like, that's all. They're not thinking about it as exchange. Totally. So they try lots of ways, and over the years they've tried to expand. I think that my reading from that literature is a basic version of something like exchange you find in non-human. What they don't quite get really to think like to. It's so obviously they don't think about these tokens as money, as having being a stand-in for something, but lots of animals can seemingly recognize something like, I take this thing and I get this other thing for it. So let me give you one version of this. Even in the early chimp study, what they've recognized is, here's what chimps can do, and that's kind of cool. So they change the supply. So they have a fixed supply of fruit available. Fruit come in different values for a chimp. So grapes are higher value than cucumbers or whatever. So and then I give you all these tokens. And so the chimps want the high value item. So they pick the token that goes with the grape. So they pick the grape. But then the grape's gone. I'm still making the grape token available to you. But if you take that, you can't exchange that for anything. Even though that's the high value token, it's not actually, in some sense, it's the token associated with the high value food item. It's not the token that you want to pick. You want to actually pick the token for the next highest food item available. And so they change what's available in the supply. And chimps will look and say, oh, what can I get? Banana is the next best thing. I guess I get the banana token. So there is that kind of understanding that's present. But secondly, thinking about property, there's something similar is true for property. So here's obviously I mentioned territoriality. Here's the other thing that lots of animals find. For example, chimps have that. So if you're the alpha, there's a certain food source, and I know if I try to get that, you'll beat me up. So there's lots of animals have this recognition that if I want that, I have to do it. I have to get it when you're not looking. I have to be sneaky about it, because in some sense you have control over that. The way I put this in the book is, here's what I think is unique about human trading, and other people have said that too. For non-human animals, property relations seem to be associated with like physical control over the item. Like, can I physically prevent you from accessing that item? What makes humans property concept interesting is that we recognize some kind of normative dimension to it. Like, I can't prevent you from having it, but you shouldn't be having it. It's still mine. That speaks to me to the fact this is where the systematicity of thought comes in. I think understanding human property, you have to see that's really related to our normative cognition more generally. But you can't just say it's normative cognition in general, because there are all sorts of norms. Like we could think about this in all sorts of ways. Why do we think there are norms about ownership? And arguably that's something I think that we're naturally inclined to do. And there's some cool developmental psychology on this, as well as obviously there's centuries of work on that from Locke and Smith and so on.
Okay, thanks. Still no hands up, so I'll take the space here because I'm really interested in your argument. I mean, let's consider sort of I buy your points about cognition and the kind of cognitions involved. I think that's really good. And that does distinguish us, I think, probably from most or all animals. Questions about chimps, but that's complex. Let's look at the later transitions you're talking about.
Yeah.
I'm talking about earlier than computers or whatever. Writing comes shortly after the birth of states. Okay, so you have states emerging, first of all, in Mesopotamia about 3000 BC, roughly, if my memory serves me rightly. And then writing follows after, and also then systems of law. So basically, then you get a different kind of property and a different kind of exchange. I mean, I know I've got no problem with generalizing concepts like exchange. I mean, social scientists do that, including economics and sociology. But there are particular kinds of exchange where you're aware of some legal authority being involved. You may want to steal or subvert it or whatever, but there's some awareness of some authority, some powerful set of institutions which bear on things like swapping apples and bananas. But particularly when money comes around, because then that authority is linked with money, which becomes the universal medium of exchange. Now that to me is pretty important. I mean, I'm focusing on that in my thinking. So I should be charitable to you, where you're taking a much longer and pan-human perspective about what's going on. And I value your point about cognition and the nature of cognition. But because learning is an important component, if I understand you correctly, in that story about what's uniquely human, that learning this new system, which is modern civilization, or not modern civilization, human civilization from about 3000 BC onwards, again, varying in different contexts and different cultures, but requiring a whole new slab of learning, including the technology of writing, the possibility of money, the legal system. Maybe not every civilization had a legal system, but a lot of them did develop. Mesopotamia did, and Greece and Rome, of course, as well. And China did in a sort of fudgy way. But there's different kinds here. But learning that new stuff also is particularly important, is it not?
Yeah, great. Two things I want to mention. Number one, I fully want to agree with what you say. So there's two ways to spin this. So you're exactly right. I emphasize the bigger picture, but I think you're exactly right that there is really interesting questions to ask about the specifics of the cultural and social technology that's available in a specific context and what kind of trading relations that, for example, makes available. Now, the thing that you could just say, oh, these are different questions. That's one question. I have the other question. But in fact, I think these questions are related. And what I like about my theory, one thing is that it gives the smaller question about specific trading relations a place. Like, I can make sense of why that is. The reason why I think we see different kinds of trade occurring in different parts of the world is because these different social cultural technologies make available slightly different trading outcomes. And so I like it because it's like it gives it a place in the framework. We can sort of see, we can make sense of why that is. There's a second aspect of this that I want to emphasize, because that in other people have sort of talked to me about this, and it's sort of interesting. These things can interact in quite complex and interesting ways. So here's one thing that I was very impressed with as an undergraduate, and in some moods I'm still impressed by it, which is this. Here's what's really bad about Roman numerals. There is no zero in the Roman numerals. This makes it awful as a calculating tool. You can't do like written addition or written subtraction with Roman numerals. You can't line it up, and this just doesn't work like this. There's no zero. So if you try to do it like an accounting balance, where like does it balance out to zero, you can't write this because you ain't got enough, like you don't have that symbol for zero. That makes Roman numerals really a very poor tool for engaging in trading. So you might think, how did the Romans manage to be traders despite that? Well, what's fun about it is they managed, that's literally the answer. They managed to be traders despite the fact that they have an awful number system. But that's because they have really great institutions otherwise. They built rich, effectively institutional structures for marketplaces and reputation tracking across vast spaces of time to overcome this. But yeah, these things can interact in funny ways. It gave you that kind of outcome. It took algebra and sort of Arabic numerals to really sort of say, oh, now we can do things. Once you have that and you have accounting conventions in place, that kickstarts trade in a whole nother dimension. Once you get accounting, you can do the innate thing, and whoa, that makes all sorts of things possible. So there's some other people who said that too. I think accounting is a hugely important part to understand sort of Western contemporary trading relations, and that like the Romans did a lot and got us far. Of course, Middle Ages kind of went sideways, but it really kicks, like once you got real accounting, things can explode quite quickly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's a really important point. Thank you. Right. Anybody want to raise any further questions? I can't see. Oh, yes, I can. Mariam.
Richard's had his hand up for answering.
Oh, sorry, Richard. Yeah, you're first. Or Mariam.
Okay. Thank you. I thought this was very interesting, Armin. I want to sort of follow up on this discussion, but I want to go back to what you talked about with cognition. At one point, you said, well, maybe humans have the ability to have some kind of more abstract cognition, and so the way I was thinking about it as you were talking is, we can explain some of this as a cognition that allows people to persuade others. So that's a big idea in Adam Smith, right? That it's all about persuading other people. But you also mentioned theft, which I hadn't thought about. But both of those things, you could imagine that kind of cognition being useful in small face-to-face societies that don't have trade, right? So I have to persuade people to do things for me. I might be able to steal things from people, but so in some ways, the interesting thing is this abstract cognition that people can offload some things onto, what can make abstract ideas, right? And I think it's well before 3000 BCE, right? I mean, if people can make knots in string or count cowrie shells, right? So that's an abstraction that other animals can't do, right? They can't say, you were talking about the tokens, right?
Yeah.
maybe if you give chimps tokens, they can sort of figure it out, but they would never occur to them they will never invent tokens, right? They will never put knots in string to do this. And so all of this stuff is, from up to the New York Stock Exchange or whatever, that's all using this idea of abstraction that humans can do. We can think not in the concrete. I mean, this is very high IQ here, right? We can think not in the concrete, but in the abstract about these things, and that's what makes humans different, right? And so in some ways, it's not really the persuasion or this or that, right? Other creatures can persuade, but only humans can make abstract concepts.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. That's a nice way to put it. So maybe here's what I want to here's my story's meant to say. It's like, that's exactly right. What makes humans unique is this ability to abstract. But I want to say that is part of the story. That can't be the full story, because if you just say, look, here's it, humans can think more abstractly, put that very crudely, compared to non-humans, we can invent tokens, then there's the natural next question is why don't we see this across the globe at all times? Why does it look differently in different cultures? Why do we get the different kind of trading relations in different ways? So there's something else that needs to be explained.
The division of token is limited by the extent of the market.
And so then we need to explain where these markets are coming from effectively. So we have a leg up towards getting there, but how do we get to which markets and which places? And so that's where the other two bits
we don't
come
need
in.
it in the tribe, but when the Europeans come for safaris, then with the extent of the market, it's higher, right? So I mean,
that's
you mentioned Henrik, and I just recently finally got around to reading The Weirdest People in the World, which I thought was very interesting, right? That it's not just that it's that cognition actually can be changed by by institutions, right? So I thought I'm still trying to deal with that idea.
Right. So I want to take some of that and I want to combine it with the thought you had earlier. There's something uniquely human about the kind of abstractions where we might be born with certain expectations about the world. So I want to say roughly is that the institutions we have help us enrich the concepts we have. They change our cognitive capacity, channel them in one direction rather than the other. They can also build new kind of thoughts, as it were, but sometimes what they do is that they take the stuff we have and channel it one way, and that has these feedback effects. So I want to take some of Henrik, but combine it with some of the more systematicity nativist stuff.
Yeah, interesting.
Okay, great. Thank you. Two more people with their hands up. One is Marion, please.
You're muted.
You're muted. Turn your mic on, please.
There, is that all right now?
That's right.
A lot of your discussion is based upon implicit assumptions about cooperation. And of course, conflict enters into markets and things too, eh? So you have, basic forms of cooperation like economies of scale. Sometimes individuals working together can achieve more per capita than they can separately, or you get the specialization in trade, And in biological theory, we generally think of specialization in trade as reducing the risk of extinction. If I grow apples and you grow oranges and we trade some of them, then if apples become, if they get spoiled or something, I'm not going to starve. We engage in sex, exchange genes, because it deals with diversity and reduce the risk of extinction. But anyway, getting back to trade, because sex is a type of trade too. Getting back to trade, there's also conflict involved in there. I trade with you because you give me something that you have, and I give you something you have, and we both have both these things. But then there's also conflict over who gets the most. I'm selling I buy some bananas at the store because I prefer bananas to the money, and he sells me the bananas because he prefers the money to the bananas. But then I would rather spend less on the bananas. He would rather give me fewer bananas, and there's a whole level of conflict here as well over that goes on in trades and exchanges and so on. You know, I'll comparative shop. I'll look at different places. Who sells the most bananas for the cheapest? He may advertise and try and convince me to get my bananas at his place rather than some other place, and so on and so forth. You know, we spend on conflict as well as spending on cooperation in markets. No?
Yeah, I think so. So I agree. And that's so that there again a couple of things here. So the first is just that's small, just as a side note. So for example, sex and things like this is the reason why I want to say we have to be a little bit careful how we want to understand trade. Yes, there's a theory of biological markets, for example, where partner exchange and finding partners is modeled on sort of a trade model. There's nothing wrong with that. I think it's just not quite that's not quite what I'm after when I want to think about the explanation of the human principle of Barter and exchange, which is a more narrowly defined sense of reciprocal cooperation, which concerns this exchange of property relations. But secondly, and that's really more to your point about the competition part, I think you're exactly right. But I want to say a little bit related to what I also said in response to Jeff. One, that's cool, and that's right. And one thing we want to maybe explain is why in different settings you get different ways of resolving this tension between cooperation and conflict in a market situation. Let me give you an example. Dick mentioned Joe Henrich's stuff. So like some of the classic findings from those cross-cultural studies on that they did back in whenever early 2000s on the ultimatum game was that responses to the ultimatum game vary massively across cultures. So if you have different people play the ultimatum game, lots of people in the West tend to go for a 50-50 split. But in some cultures, super low offers are both made and accepted. In some other cultures, hyper fair offers over 50% are made and rejected. And so there's a really interesting question about, even though different cultures engage seemingly and can understand these kind of trading relations, they have very different views of how to understand why that is. And one of the things that Henrich does in the book is try to understand why is this 50-50 thing very appealing in some settings and not so appealing in other settings. Now, one of the things I want to say is that we're all starting with the same endowment. We all can understand how this goes, but how that's being, that endowment of our thoughts about property relations, how that's being channeled in which direction, that depends on the kind of social and cognitive technology we have available and the kind of cultural learning we have.
Good point.
So just very quickly, as a personal thing, I was part of, when I was an undergrad at the LSE, and they came and did some of the behavioral experiments on the ultimatum game. And we did this, I played it, and I had never heard of it before. It was a first year undergrad, whatever, played it, and I looked at this and it's like, I get this. I did like a year of economics or 3/4 of a year. It's like, I totally understand this game. So $1 is better than no dollar. So obviously I got offered $1. So clearly I'm going to take the dollar. That's the utility maximizing option. That's totally the right answer. And then I go and they're like, okay, so you see the distribution. Most people rejected the dollar offer, like anything below 30% typically is rejected. Median offer was 50%. And you see this little bump of those people that accepted the $1. These are the victims of game theory. These are all the people here that took the game theory class and they like, this is the right response to this. The point I'm trying to make is we can all understand it, but how we resolve this kind of conflict. Am I happy with the trade, terms of trade you're offering me, and like, do I want to maximize and how much? That depends on the kind of environment that I grew up in, where different things might be emphasized, as well as the kind of technology I have available for tracking these things in the first place.
I think that's a really good point, that how you deal with cooperation and conflict and so on is also culturally quite different.
Yep.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sure that's true. Thank you.
Okay. We are running out of time. I have 2 more hands. If it's okay with you, Armin, can I take the 2 questions, one from Jan Willem, another one from Ugo, and then you answer at the end to both of those? That'd be
I'll
right?
do my best. Yeah.
Great. So Jan Willem, please.
Thanks for the talk. That was really very interesting.
Thank you.
I've got one sort of critical comment. I will keep that very short, and then a question that I think follows up a little bit on what you were discussing with Marion just now.
Okay.
The comment is that I'm not necessarily convinced by how you present your story, in the sense that you say there are these 3 things out there, and I'm combining them, and implicitly you're saying in a new way. Maybe one way to challenge you a little bit on that is, I'm not that sure that what you're saying is so different from what sort of the gene culture coevolution approach would say, in the sense that they are on the gene side accepting innate things, and then on the culture side accepting your sort of story. And even the idea that an important part of that story is that we have developed certain cognitions to become very good social learners is sort of in what I would see as their approach. So in that sense, my sense is that your story is a really interesting story of cumulative gene culture coevolution. But then maybe the 3 things that you're sort of putting up there maybe have already been combined in this literature, and you seem to be presenting that literature as being in one of the 3 boxes only, in the cultural box. I'm not that sure about that is, yeah, that's a fair way of looking at that literature. And
Okay, thanks,
sort of
Shannon.
sort
Ugo,
of
could you come in?
can,
Sorry, you got
can
another
I,
point.
Yeah, I don't know.
briefly.
I wanna throw in the question really quickly, and then you can see if you even want to respond to that. What you were discussing with Marion, that my other note was, how is what you are explaining different or related to explaining cooperation more generally? And what is the role of what you called cognitive cognition in that explanation, and the role of morality? And why I think this is an interesting question, and that's my last sentence, is that on the standards neoclassical models of markets and trades, there is this sort of presumption that morality is out. You don't need morality. The market, the price mechanism takes care of the morality. And I would be really interested in your comment on that, but you may not have time. Thanks,
Ugo.
Jeff.
Thank you.
Ugo.
Yes, I would like to go back to the point that was raised by Jeff. I like very much the talk. The only problem that I have is that what we mean by human exchange presupposes that there is some acceptance of property rights. So in a way, there is a preliminary question. How did humans evolve the idea of property rights? So how did they switch from simple idea of possession to the idea of property rights? Because if you have only possession based on the fact that you control the thing, and it's basically something that requires some immediate power and strength and so on, and you do not have property rights, then the human way of exchanging becomes very difficult to understand. One of the attributes of property rights is that you can exchange things, but property rights are a more general thing. You can have property rights without exchanges. What property rights recognize is that there must be some even elementary form of community enforcement, so that according to a certain community, the fact that you have got some right on something means that somebody else, the others have a duty not to take it, and because they have got this duty, you are not exposed to the liberty of others to take your stuff, and all these complicated relations. So you must first explain how these emerged, and then part of it will be exchanged, I believe.
Yeah.
Great. 3 minutes,
Great.
I think. 3 minutes for the response. A lot there. Really appreciate the question. Let me start with with Ugo's question and related to the first question of Jan Willem. In a way, that is so these questions respond to each other. So first thing I want to acknowledge totally. You are like so that's Jan Willem was saying, look, don't the gene culture coevolution people say stuff like this? So first I want to know, yeah, absolutely, stuff like this is in the literature, and I want to acknowledge there's stuff like this out there. Turns out that the devil is in the details. The key is exactly this: is to get right. So turns out that if you dig deeper in the gene culture coevolution stuff, I always feel like they go this way and they're sort of right, and then they turn slightly to the left. Where I want to say, no, we were so close, and you turn this way. So for example, so here's my response to Ugo's question. I think that's exactly for the reasons you say. We got to start by recognizing that humans are born with an innate endowments of property cognition that's just different from what we find in non-human animals. That's what I think the nativists get exactly right, whereas the gene culture coevolution people don't have that generally. Celia Hayes, very clear on emphasizing our endowment is not that, it's much flatter. Thomas Sallow, that's not in Thomas Sallow. He gets that from, the key thing for Thomas Sallow is this sort of we intention, shared intention thinking. And from that, he wants to construct other things out of that. I think that's not the right way to go. We got to put more in to begin with. But I want to say, let's not go all the way nativist and say, let's just let's bite the nativist bullet and then we have the answer. We can't get rid of the culture learning part either. The question is how to combine culture learning, innate endowments, and technological institutional dependence. So that, like, everyone, I think, so recognizes these three elements matter. The question is how to put them together. And so what maybe didn't come out as clearly in the talk is how that the key for me is that interplay. And I think for me, my contribution is that particular version of the interplay, which brings me to the second question of Jan Wilhelm, which is how the role of morality is. I think you're exactly right. That is a fundamentally important part too. One of the other chapters in the book speaks specifically to that. So in lots of ways, I want to say the following: understanding distinctively human moral cognition works on a similar feedback loop, but importantly, these feedback loops interact in important ways. And so one small place where you can see this is you're exactly right. So some people sort of think once you have a market, morality goes out the window, but that's partly right and that's partly wrong. What's right about it is one of the benefits that a technology institution like a market gives is that I no longer have to track, say, if the market is fair and works well, then I can rely on the fact that the property distribution that we have now is fair in some sense. If the starting endowment was fair and if all the trading relations went fairly, I can rely on the market working well to accept that. So it allows me to outsource some of my moral cognition. That's really nice. But on the other hand, to understand property relations in the human sense, we gotta place them in a normative framework of what I ought to own. So morality and normative cognition are tightly interwoven. So understanding morality is really also about understanding normative cognition, and that brings us back into having to think about the way normative cognition more generally has evolved, and that interacts both with markets and morality in different ways.
And maybe
would love to talk more, but that's it.
Yeah, I think there's a nice link to what Ugo was saying, in the sense that he was asking, in a sense, aren't property rights first? And property rights are moral, and there's something specific about our sense of property rights, and specifically human. So in what you just said, I think there's a lot more interesting stuff to discuss.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Yes, I would love to.
It's not the first time that all the interesting stuff's come in the last 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're back to Darwin, because Darwin said humans are uniquely moral. So there's great insight there to connect up with. Yeah, it was fantastically stimulating, Armin. It's really, I didn't agree with everything you said, but I learned a lot from what you said, and I'm sure other people appreciate it too. So thank you very much indeed.
Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.